The history books tell you a simple story. They say the Spanish conquistador Juan Ponce de León died in Cuba in 1521, a victim of a poisoned arrow to his thigh during a failed attempt to colonize Florida. It's a neat, tidy end to a brutal chapter of exploration. But what if that story is a lie? A carefully constructed deception to hide a terrifying truth. A truth so profound it had to be buried for 500 years. Because the man who died in Cuba was not the legendary explorer. It was his double, a decoy. The real Ponce de León never left the shores of Florida. He stayed because he found it. He found the one thing that has driven humanity mad since the dawn of time. A secret so powerful, it promised to unravel the very laws of God and nature. So, what really happened to the most famous seeker in history? And what is the terrible price of eternal life? The answer doesn't lie in our history books. It lies in the one place no one was ever meant to look. The official record is clear. Juan Ponce de León was a man forged in the fires of the Spanish Reconquista. He was ruthless, ambitious, and insatiably greedy. He had sailed with Columbus on his second voyage, conquered Puerto Rico, and amassed a fortune in gold and slaves. By 1513, he was a middle-aged man, powerful yet restless, his hair graying, his body bearing the scars of countless battles. He had heard whispers from the native Taino people, stories of a mythical land to the northwest called Bimini, a land not of gold but of something far more precious. A spring, a river, a fountain whose waters could reverse the ravages of age and restore youth to the old. For a man who had everything but time, the allure was irresistible. He secured a contract from the Spanish crown, granting him the right to discover and govern this new land. His primary mission, stated in the royal charter, was to find gold and claim territory for Spain. There is no official mention, not a single word in the royal documents about a fountain of youth. Historians will tell you the legend was attached to his name years after his death by a rival chronicler, a political smear to make him look like a foolish, vain old man. They claim he never even searched for it. But that is the official story. The truth, as is so often the case, was written in a different kind of ink. It began not with a public decree, but with a secret meeting. A Taino chieftain, his life spared by Ponce de León during the conquest of Puerto Rico, offered the conquistador a gift in exchange for his family's freedom. It wasn't gold or jewels. It was a map, not drawn on parchment, but tattooed onto a piece of cured manatee skin. It was a strange, cryptic chart, depicting a coastline that looked vaguely like the Florida Peninsula, but with symbols and star alignments that belonged to no known system of navigation. The chieftain spoke of a place the Spanish called La Florida, the land of flowers, but which his ancestors called Sequari, the place of beginnings. He warned that the path was guarded by spirits, and that the water itself demanded a sacrifice. It did not give its gift for free. Ponce de León, a man of cold, hard calculation, was deeply superstitious, like most sailors of his day. He saw the map not as folklore, but as a divine sign. This was his true quest. Colonizing Florida was merely a cover, a plausible excuse to fund his private obsession. He assembled a crew handpicking the most loyal, the most desperate, and the most expendable men from his campaigns. He told them they were searching for riches, but his inner circle knew the real prize. They set sail from Puerto Rico with 3 ships, but one of them, a small, swift caravel, carried a secret cargo: alchemical equipment, ancient texts on longevity, and a cage of aging greyhounds, crude test subjects for the miracle to come. They made landfall on the coast of Florida in April of 1513. The land was beautiful but hostile, a humid green labyrinth of mangrove swamps, venomous snakes, and insects that swarmed in thick black clouds. The local tribes, like the Calusa, were not the peaceful islanders he had subjugated in the Caribbean. They were fierce, powerful warriors who watched the Spanish intruders from the shadows of the cypress trees, their arrows tipped with the poison of the manchineel tree, the little apple of death. Days turned into weeks. The official expedition charted the coastline, skirmished with natives, and noted the flora and fauna, all for the official record. But every night, Ponce de León and his secret shore party would disembark, following the tattooed map into the suffocating darkness of the interior. The map was a puzzle. It didn't lead them to a single point. It led them to a series of natural landmarks, each one a test. A cluster of ancient sinkholes that had to be navigated by the light of a specific constellation. a river that flowed backwards during the tidal surge, a grove of petrified trees that seemed to hum with a strange energy. The men were on edge. They were soldiers, not mystics. They began to whisper that their commander was mad, chasing a phantom. Morale plummeted. Fights broke out. Then they found the first sign. Deep in a swamp, exactly where the map indicated a symbol of a coiled serpent, they found a spring. It was not the fountain. The water was brackish and warm, but growing on its banks was a species of fern that glowed with a faint, phosphorescent light in the moonlight. One of the men, his arm badly slashed in a skirmish the day before, washed his wound in the spring water. By morning, the deep gash, which should have been festering in the humid air, was nearly closed, the skin already healing with almost no scar. Panic and excitement warred within the camp. They had found something unnatural, something that defied their understanding of the world. Ponce de León, his faith vindicated, became even more driven. He pushed his men harder, deeper into the unforgiving wilderness. They followed the map to a vast, shallow lake, dotted with thousands of small islands, what we now know as the Everglades. The map called it the Sea of Grass. According to the chieftain's story, the fountain was not a grand, ornate structure, but a hidden source, a place where the water of life seeped up from deep within the earth before it was diluted by the swamp. It was said to be hidden on an island that was not an island, marked by a tree that was not a tree. For weeks, they pulled their way through the labyrinthine waterways, lost and delirious from heat and hunger. The Calusa warriors hunted them relentlessly, silent ghosts in the sawgrass. Men vanished in the night, snatched by alligators or the arrows of the unseen enemy. The expedition was bleeding out, dying a slow death in the sweltering heat. Ponce de León's obsession was costing him everything. His men were on the verge of mutiny. They had found no gold, no glory, only mud, blood, and madness. They gave him an ultimatum: turn back to the ships, or they would leave him to die in the swamp. Cornered and desperate, Ponce de León studied the map one last time under the flickering light of a torch. The island that was not an island, the tree that was not a tree. He had been interpreting it literally. But then, as the smoke from the torch swirled around the tattooed skin, the pattern seemed to shift. He saw it. It wasn't a riddle. It was a celestial observation. The tree was a constellation, the Southern Cross, which was barely visible on the horizon at that latitude. And the island was the one spot in the entire sea of grass from which that constellation, at a specific hour before dawn, would appear to sink directly into a particular sliver of dark water between the mangroves. It was a location that could only be found by someone who knew exactly where and when to look. He now knew. The Fountain of Youth was less than a league away. He ordered his men to lower a small boat. The heat was a physical weight pressing down, the air thick with the smell of salt and decay. Insects buzzed in a dense, feverish cloud around their heads. As they rode into the labyrinth of mangrove roots, the world grew quiet. The sounds of the open sea replaced by the gentle lapping of water against wood and the occasional, unsettling cry of a hidden bird. The water here was black, so still it perfectly reflected the tangled canopy above, creating the dizzying illusion of rowing through a flooded, upside-down forest. The moonlight, which had been their guide, was now reduced to thin, silver daggers piercing the gloom. Ponce de León's heart hammered against his ribs. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking predator. Every gnarled root looked like a coiled serpent. His men were silent, their faces tight with a mixture of fear and awe. They were trespassing. They were entering a place not meant for them, a sacred, secret corner of the world. After what felt like an eternity of navigating the claustrophobic channels, they saw it. A small clearing, almost a perfect circle, where the mangroves pulled back as if in reverence. And in the center, a gentle mound of moss-covered rock, from which a trickle of water, clear as liquid crystal, emerged. It didn't gush or bubble, but simply appeared, flowing into a small stone-lined pool before disappearing back into the swamp. The air here felt different, cooler, cleaner. There was a profound silence, a stillness that felt ancient and alive. This had to be it. It matched the Taino's descriptions perfectly. A place hidden by water and shadow, a spring that was born from rock without a source. With trembling hands, Ponce de León knelt by the pool. He saw his own reflection staring back at him, a tired, weathered man, his face lined by the sun and the sea, his beard flecked with gray. This was the face of a man who had spent a lifetime chasing glory, gold, and now time itself. He cupped his hands, the cool water a shock against his skin. He lifted it to his lips and drank. The water was sweet, pure, unlike any he had ever tasted. It was cold and invigorating. He drank again and then a third time, letting it wash over him. He waited. He waited for the surge of energy, for the aches in his bones to vanish, for the wrinkles on his face to smooth away. He waited for the miracle, and nothing. He felt refreshed, yes, as anyone would from drinking cool water on a sweltering night. But the magic, the divine reversal of time, it didn't come. A cold dread, far colder than the spring water, began to seep into his soul. Was this it? A simple freshwater spring in the middle of a swamp? Had he been duped? Had he dragged his men through this hellish landscape on the word of a native, who was either lying or laughing at him? The silence of the clearing now seemed to mock him. The fountain of youth was just water. But was Ponce de Leon's quest truly the origin of this powerful idea? Was he the first to risk everything for a sip of immortality? Not even close. The truth is, the hunt for a magical, life-giving water is a story as old as civilization itself, a fundamental human dream woven into the very fabric of our oldest myths. To find its real source, we have to travel back not centuries but millennia. 2,000 years before Ponce de Leon ever set sail, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote of a legendary land in Ethiopia, inhabited by a people called the Macrobian. The Macrobian were said to be the tallest and most beautiful of all men, and they lived on average to be 120 years old. When the Persian king Cambyses sent spies to their land, they were asked what the secret to their long life was. The Macrobian king led them to a spring, a fountain whose water had a peculiar quality. When they washed in it, their skin became sleek and glossy, as if they had bathed in oil, and a fragrance like that of violets emanated from it. The water was so light, the king claimed that nothing would float in it, not even wood. He explained that it was their constant use of this water that granted them their incredible longevity. Here, in the 5th century BC, we have one of the very first documented accounts of a specific physical fountain of youth. The idea persisted, bubbling up in different cultures across the globe. In the Middle Ages, the legend was reignited by the fantastical tales of Prester John, a mythical Christian king whose lost kingdom was rumored to be hidden somewhere in the East. Letters, supposedly from Prester John himself, circulated throughout Europe, describing a realm of unimaginable wonders. And at the heart of his kingdom, he wrote, was a spring that flowed from the foothills of paradise. Whoever drank from this spring, even if they had not eaten for days, would be cured of all fatigue and would feel as if they were 32 years old forever. This story captivated medieval Europe, merging the Christian idea of Eden with the ancient pagan dream of a physical fountain of immortality. But perhaps the most compelling and dramatic of all the ancient searches for eternal life belongs to none other than Alexander the Great. Long before he became a symbol of military genius, Alexander was a student of Aristotle, and he was consumed by a desire not just to conquer the known world, but to understand its deepest secrets. As his conquests pushed him further and further east, into the mysterious lands of Persia and India, he heard whispers of a place known as the Land of Darkness. It was a region of perpetual night, impossible to navigate, but hidden within it, the legend said, was the water of life, a spring that could grant immortality to any mortal who drank from it. Obsessed, Alexander took a trusted contingent of his men and ventured into the gloom. The journey was treacherous. The darkness was absolute, a tangible presence that disoriented his soldiers and frayed their nerves. To keep from getting lost, he released horses and mares into the darkness, knowing the foals would cry out and the mares would return to them, allowing his party to retrace their steps. After days of travel, they finally came upon a shimmering phosphorescent spring. This was it, the water of life. But as Alexander approached, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was an ancient, wizened man, the guardian of the spring. In some versions of the myth, this man is the prophet Al-Qaidar, the Green One, an immortal servant of God. He warned the great conqueror. He told Alexander that he stood before two springs side by side. One was the water of life. The other was the water of forgetfulness. If he drank from the first, he would live forever. But he would be doomed to wander the earth alone, watching everyone he ever knew or loved grow old and die. He would witness the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of civilizations, an eternal solitary spectator to the endless march of time. If he drank from the second, he would forget everything. his ambition, his conquests, his name, and live out his days in blissful ignorance. The guardian presented Alexander with a choice that was no choice at all. What is the value of eternal life if it is stripped of all meaning, love, and connection? What is the point of conquering the world if you are doomed to outlive it 1,000 times over? Alexander, the man who had never known defeat, was finally faced with an obstacle he could not overcome with force or strategy. He understood the terrible price of his desire. He turned away from the spring and led his men back out of the land of darkness, choosing a mortal life, filled with purpose and glory, over an immortal one, empty and alone. He had found the source of eternal life, only to realize that true immortality wasn't about living forever, but about creating a legacy that would. This cautionary tale became a cornerstone of the myth, a profound warning embedded within the fantasy. The Fountain of Youth wasn't just a physical prize to be won, it was a philosophical test. And for most, it was a test they were destined to fail. The water promised life, but its true nature, its hidden cost, was something far more complex. And it wasn't always a spring. Sometimes the promise of eternal life didn't come from the ground at all. It came from a cup. A simple, unassuming vessel, yet it held a power far greater than any spring bubbling from the earth. The Holy Grail. While the Fountain of Youth was a promise of nature, a gift of the planet itself, the Grail was something else entirely. It was an artifact, a man-made object imbued with the divine. Its story isn't one of geology, but of theology, of faith. The legend has many roots, tangled and deep. For some, it was the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper, the very vessel that held the first Eucharist. For others, it was the cup that caught his blood as he hung on the cross, carried by Joseph of Arimathea. In this telling, Joseph, a secret disciple, brought the sacred cup to a distant, misty island, a place that would one day be called Britain. There, the cup and the promise it held would sleep for centuries, waiting for a kingdom worthy of its quest. That kingdom was Camelot. King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table represented the pinnacle of chivalry, a brief, shining moment of justice and honor in a dark and brutal world. But even in this golden age, something was missing. A spiritual sickness had begun to creep into the court. The knights, in their peace and prosperity, had grown complacent. And so, one Pentecost, as they all sat at the great round table, a vision appeared. A thunderclap, a sunbeam, and then, veiled in white silk, the Holy Grail drifted through the hall, filling the air with sweet odors and providing every knight with the food his heart most desired. But no one saw the cup itself. It was a promise, a challenge. And in that moment, the greatest and most tragic quest of the Arthurian age was born. Sir Gawain, Arthur's own nephew, was the first to swear an oath. He would ride for a year and a day, and not return until he had seen the Grail unveiled. One by one, the other knights, caught in the fervor, made the same vow. King Arthur was heartbroken. He knew this quest would not unite them, but shatter them. He saw it for what it was, the end of the Round Table. Because the Grail was not a prize to be won with a strong sword arm or a noble steed. It was a test of the soul. And no soul was more tested than that of Sir Lancelot, the greatest knight in the world, the king's champion, brave, noble, and peerless in combat. By all earthly measures, he was the most worthy. But Lancelot had a secret, a sin that clung to him like a shroud, his adulterous love for Queen Guinevere, Arthur's wife. This love, which he saw as his greatest strength and inspiration, was, in the eyes of God, his greatest impurity. His quest for the Grail became a torturous journey of self-discovery. He was repeatedly humbled, defeated by lesser knights, and confronted by hermits and holy men who laid his sins bare. He would get agonizingly close, even reaching the chamber of the Grail itself. But as he moved to enter, a divine fire, a blast of holy energy, would strike him down, leaving him in a coma-like state for 24 days, one day for each year he had lived in sin. Lancelot could see the prize, he could feel its presence, but he could never, ever touch it. His quest proved that earthly greatness meant nothing. The Grail demanded a perfection that Lancelot, for all his might, could not achieve. His was the tragedy of being the best of men in a quest that required more than a man. Others came close. Sir Percival, a knight raised in isolation, was pure through his innocence. He was a holy fool, who didn't understand the complexities of sin and courtly life. He saw the Grail, but his hesitation, his failure to ask the right question, "Whom does the Grail serve?" caused the vision to fade. His journey was one of learning, of slowly understanding that purity wasn't just the absence of sin, but the active pursuit of divine knowledge. Then there was Sir Bors, the only one of the three main questers to see the Grail and actually return to Camelot. He was steadfast, loyal, and chaste, but even he was not the chosen one. He was the witness, the one meant to survive and tell the tale. The true Grail Knight was someone else entirely. Sir Galahad, the illegitimate son of Lancelot himself, conceived through deception, yet born without sin. He was the perfect knight. From the moment he arrived at Camelot and took his seat at the Siege Perilous, the seat at the Round Table reserved for the Grail Knight, which was fatal to any other who sat in it, it was clear he was destined for this purpose. Where Lancelot fought with passion and fury, Galahad fought with a serene divine grace. Where others were tempted by earthly pleasures, Galahad was entirely focused on his spiritual goal. His quest was not a struggle but a procession. He was not finding the Grail was finding him. Together, Galahad, Percival, and Bors finally reached the Grail Castle. And there Galahad, the pure of heart, was granted the ultimate vision. He saw the vessel unveiled. He looked inside, and what he saw was so profound, so holy, that it dissolved the boundaries between the physical and the spiritual. He achieved a state of grace so complete that the earth could no longer hold him. And this is where the Grail's promise of eternal life differs so profoundly from the Fountain of Youth. The fountain offers an extension of earthly existence. More years, more sunrises, more time in this body on this plane. The Grail offered an escape from it. After seeing the Grail's mystery, Galahad prayed for his release. He knew that to return to the world after witnessing such perfection would be an agony. And so as he prayed, angels descended from heaven and carried his soul upwards. Sir Galahad did not live forever on earth. He achieved a true spiritual immortality by transcending the mortal world entirely. He didn't just drink from the cup of life. He became one with its divine source. This is the hidden cost of the Grail. The Fountain of Youth might demand a sacrifice or have a hidden curse, but the Grail demands everything. It demands the surrender of your earthly self. To be worthy of it, you must give up all worldly attachments. Love, wealth, power, ambition, and ultimately life itself. The quest for the Grail destroyed the fellowship of the Round Table. The best knights were lost. The bonds of loyalty were frayed. And in the spiritual vacuum that followed, the old sins of the court, Lancelot and Guinevere's affair, the jealousy of other knights, festered and grew, ultimately leading to civil war and the death of King Arthur. In their search for heavenly perfection, they lost their earthly paradise. The Grail, then, represents a different kind of human yearning. It's not just the fear of death, but the hope for meaning, the belief that there is something more than this cycle of life and decay. It's the idea that immortality isn't about having more time, but about making your time matter on a cosmic scale. But the legend left an indelible mark on the human psyche. The idea of a sacred object, a relic that could grant miraculous healing and spiritual salvation, was intoxicating. The story of Galahad was one of divine ascension, but for most people that was too abstract. They latched onto the more tangible promises: healing, sustenance, life. The line began to blur. Was the Grail a purely spiritual goal? Or could its power have a physical effect? Could it perhaps restore youth? Could it grant a long, blessed life here on earth? The myth of a spiritual quest for a heavenly afterlife began to merge once more with the older, more primal desire for a physical quest for an earthly one. The cup and the spring, the artifact and the natural wonder, began to flow into one another, creating a single powerful current of myth. And this current would carry European explorers across the Atlantic, not just in search of gold and glory, but in search of a miracle. They were looking for a new Eden, and in that new world, they fully expected to find its most legendary prize. And so the stage was set. A collision of worlds was imminent, not just of continents and cultures, but of myths. The old world, saturated with its ancient tales of eternal life, was about to project its deepest longings onto a new, vast, and misunderstood landscape. And at the heart of this collision stood one man, a figure whose name would become forever, and perhaps unfairly, synonymous with this impossible quest: Juan Ponce de León. To understand how a hardened, pragmatic Spanish conquistador became the poster child for a mythical fountain, you have to understand the man himself. He was not a wide-eyed dreamer or a philosopher king. He was a product of his time, forged in the brutal crucible of the Reconquista, the centuries-long war to reclaim Spain from the Moors. He was a man of action, a soldier and administrator, and by all accounts ruthlessly ambitious. He had sailed with Columbus on his second voyage in 1493, a young man hungry for the trinity that drove all conquistadors: God, gold, and glory. He had seen firsthand the New World and its possibilities. He helped crush the indigenous Taino rebellion on the island of Hispaniola, earning land and power for his efforts. He then set his sights on the neighboring island, known today as Puerto Rico. He conquered it, subjugated its people, and became its first governor. This was a man who dealt in the cold, hard currency of power, land, and forced labor. He was a politician and a warrior who understood supply lines, military strategy, and royal decrees far better than he understood fanciful legends. So why him? Why did this man, of all people, pivot from conquering islands to chasing a phantom? The answer lies in the very air the Spanish breathed in the Caribbean. It was an atmosphere thick with rumors, a fever dream of possibility. Every jungle-clad island just over the horizon could hold the next great empire, the next mountain of gold. And the stories they heard from the native Taino people only fueled this fire. But this is where the story gets complicated, where translation becomes transformation. The Spanish, remember, were primed to find wonders. They came expecting Eden. So when the Taino spoke of a mythical land to the north, a place called Bimini, the Spanish listened with rapt attention. According to some of these fragmented, second-hand accounts, Bimini was a land of incredible wealth and ease. But it also supposedly held a special river, or a spring, with remarkable restorative powers. A river that could make old men young again. Now, did the Taino actually believe in a literal fountain of youth? It's highly unlikely. It's far more probable that their stories were allegorical, or referred to a specific place of spiritual significance, perhaps a river with healing mud or waters that were simply revered for their purity. It could have been a story meant to describe a paradise, a land of plenty where people lived long, healthy lives, not one of magical age reversal. But the Spanish weren't anthropologists. They were conquerors with a very specific cultural lens. When a Spanish soldier, his mind already filled with the legends of Alexander the Great's healing river and the tales of Prester John, heard a Taino elder speak of restorative waters, his brain made an immediate, powerful connection. He didn't hear sacred river. He heard fountain of youth. It was a profound, world-altering case of confirmation bias. The Spanish found exactly what they were looking for, not in the soil of the New World, but in the fertile ground of their own imaginations, projected onto the words of the people they were conquering. And these rumors swirled around the Caribbean, passed from sailor to soldier, growing more elaborate with each telling. They reached the ears of the powerful, including Juan Ponce de León. By 1511, Ponce de León was a man in a precarious position. He was rich and accomplished, but he had been pushed out of the governorship of Puerto Rico by the son of Christopher Columbus, who had a stronger legal claim to the title. At nearly 50 years old, an advanced age for the time, Ponce de León was a man without a mission, a conqueror without a kingdom. He was facing the twilight of his own life and career, a man who had achieved so much, only to see it slipping away. What does a man like that do? He looks for the next horizon. The rumors of Bimini offered him a perfect opportunity. It was a chance for a new conquest, new lands, new gold, and a new title. And perhaps, just perhaps, a chance to reclaim something more. A chance to turn back the clock, not just on his career, but on his own mortality. So he did what powerful men do. He went to the king. In 1512, Ponce de León secured a royal contract, an asiento from King Ferdinand of Spain. The official document is a fascinating piece of history. It grants him the exclusive right to discover and populate the island of Bimini. It meticulously details the division of any gold or treasures found. It commands him to convert the natives to Christianity. But it says absolutely nothing, not one single word about a fountain of youth. This wasn't the primary official goal. The quest for gold and land was always front and center. The fountain was the whisper, the secret lottery ticket, the ultimate unspoken prize. It was the rumor that could motivate men to venture into the complete unknown when the promise of gold alone might not be enough. It was the ultimate venture capital pitch for a high-risk expedition. With his royal charter in hand, Ponce de León began preparations. He was a wealthy man, and he financed the expedition himself, pouring his fortune into the venture. He assembled a small fleet of 3 ships: the Santiago, the San Cristobal, and the Santa Maria de la Consolación. He hired experienced pilots, including Anton de Alaminos, who had also sailed with Columbus and was considered one of the most skilled navigators of his day. He gathered a crew of sailors and soldiers, men as tough and as hopeful as he was, and stocked the ships with supplies for a long, uncertain journey: hardtack biscuits, salted meat, water, wine, and of course, weapons. On March 4, 1513, from the port of San German in Puerto Rico, Ponce de León's small fleet weighed anchor and set sail. The ships pointed northwest into a vast and empty section of the map, a part of the sea the Spanish called the Golfo y Mar de la Yegua, the Gulf and Sea of the Mare. They were leaving the familiar island chains of the Caribbean behind, sailing on the power of a rumor that had crossed an ocean and passed through the filter of a dozen different cultures. They were chasing a ghost, a story born in ancient Greece, nurtured in medieval Europe, and now supposedly located in a land the Taino called Bimini. As the shores of Puerto Rico faded into the horizon, these men sailed on with a potent mix of greed, faith, and a desperate universal hope. They were sailing toward a myth, but what they were about to find was something far more real: a vast and sprawling land that would change the map of the world forever. They didn't know it yet, but they were on a direct course for the coast of a new continent, on a journey that would cement Ponce de León's name in legend, not as the conqueror he was, but as the eternal seeker of a miracle he would never find. The salt-caked timbers of the Santiago groaned, a familiar sound after weeks on the open ocean. But then a new sound cut through the monotony: the cry of a lookout. Land. It wasn't just another island, another speck of green in an endless blue. This was different. Through the morning haze of late March 1513, the crew saw a long, low, unbroken coastline stretching as far as the eye could see, blanketed in a riot of vegetation so green it seemed to hum with life. After the jagged rocks and sparse palms of the Bahamas, this was a vision of paradise, a true continent. What they saw wasn't just land, it was a promise of wealth, of glory, of a new world to be claimed for Spain and for God. For Ponce de León, it was the promise of a legacy separate from Columbus, a kingdom of his own. He was 53 years old, an age when most men were slowing down, but he felt the fire of a young man. This land, he believed, was his destiny. They sailed along the coast for days, charting the strange new shoreline. It was the Easter season, a time of celebration and rebirth in Spain known as Pascua Florida, the festival of flowers. Seeing the coast blanketed in blossoms, the name seemed preordained. Ponce de León claimed the land for the Spanish crown and christened it La Florida. The name would stick, a permanent reminder of that first impression of a land teeming with life, a Garden of Eden on the edge of the known world. But Eden has its guardians, and these shores were not empty. On April 2nd, they finally dropped anchor and a party rowed ashore. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and unknown flowers. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the buzz of insects and the cry of strange birds. They were being watched. From the dense thicket of mangroves in Saw Palmetto, eyes followed their every move. The first encounter was not with a welcoming party offering gifts, but with warriors. The people of this land, likely the Calusa or the Timucua, were not like the Taino of Hispaniola, who had been so tragically easy to subjugate. These men were tall, powerful, and utterly unafraid. Their arrows were tipped with sharpened bone and stone, and they flew with deadly accuracy. The Spanish advance was met not with awe, but with organized, furious resistance. The conquistadors were shocked. Their steel armor, their crossbows, their terrifying harquebuses, the weapons that had shattered native resistance across the Caribbean, were met here with a ferocity they did not expect. The natives used the terrain to their advantage, melting back into the swamps and forests, striking in ambushes, and then disappearing like ghosts. This wasn't a conquest. It was a grueling, bloody skirmish on the fringe of a continent that seemed to want to swallow them whole. Days turned into weeks. Ponce de León's primary mission was not to find a mythical spring. His royal contract was explicit: discover and settle the islands of Bimini. But his personal mission, the one that truly drove him, was the same one that drove every conquistador: to find gold. He searched for the telltale signs, for the great cities of gold that the explorer's grapevine buzzed about. But in Florida, there were no cities of gold. There were no grand temples, no mines, no visible sources of the wealth he craved. The people he encountered wore little in the way of gold ornaments. Their wealth was the land itself, a concept the Spanish could barely comprehend. His men grew restless. They hadn't signed up for this. They were veterans of brutal but profitable campaigns, used to quick victories and rich plunder. This was different. This was fighting an enemy they couldn't pin down in a land that fought back with its own weapons. Venomous snakes, swarms of mosquitoes, and a suffocating heat that rusted their armor and rotted their supplies. The water they found was brackish and swill, far from any life-giving elixir. If anything, this land seemed to drain the life out of them, not restore it. Did anyone speak of a fountain of youth? Perhaps. But it would have been in mockery. A bitter joke shared between exhausted soldiers as they swatted at insects and tended to their wounds. Found that magic water yet, Juan? One might have sneered to another, looking at the fetid swamp around them. The grand quest for eternal life was a world away from the grim reality of survival in the Florida mangroves. Ponce de León was a pragmatist. He was a soldier and an administrator. He questioned captured natives, but his questions weren't about magic. They were about gold, about food, about the lay of the land, about the strength of neighboring tribes. Through translators who knew a patchwork of native dialects, he tried to piece together a map of this new world. And the answers he got were frustrating. The natives spoke of great chiefdoms to the north and west, but their descriptions were vague, wrapped in their own mythologies that the Spanish couldn't decipher. He was failing. The expedition was costing a fortune, and he had nothing to show for it but a few scratches on a map and a crew on the verge of mutiny. The beautiful island of Florida was proving to be a vast, impenetrable, and hostile peninsula. It was a dead end, but Ponce de León was not a man who accepted defeat. He had charted the entire East Coast, a significant achievement, but it wasn't enough. He made a decision. He would not retreat back to Puerto Rico empty-handed. He would round the tip of this stubborn land and explore the other side. He ordered his ships to sail south, navigating through a treacherous maze of small islands and coral reefs, what we now call the Florida Keys. Here, the clashes with the Calusa people became even more violent. The Calusa were a maritime people, masters of the sea in their massive dugout canoes. They saw the Spanish ships not as vessels of gods, but as intruders in their territory, and they attacked the Spanish flotilla with a coordinated naval assault. It was a fierce battle, canoe against caravel, arrow against cannon. The Spanish prevailed, but not without cost. They were battered, weary, and no closer to their goal. As they rounded the peninsula and began to head north into the Gulf of Mexico, a captured Calusa warrior, under duress, finally gave them a story they wanted to hear. He didn't speak of a fountain. He spoke of his own people's beliefs. He spoke of a great chiefdom to the west, a place called Kalos, whose leader was rumored to possess immense riches. He told them that all the gold and silver they could imagine flowed from a great river, deep in the interior of the land. It was a sliver of hope, a new direction. Gold, a river of it. This was the language Ponce de León understood. The fountain of youth was a fool's dream, a tavern tale. But a river of gold? That was a prize worthy of a conquistador. He turned the prows of his ships west, into the uncharted waters of the Gulf. He was no longer exploring the land of flowers. He was now hunting for a river of gold, a quest that would lead him even deeper into the heart of a continent that had already proven to be his most formidable adversary. He was sailing toward a new legend, one that would be just as elusive and far more deadly than the one history would remember him for. His return to Puerto Rico was not one of a defeated man, but of a strategist regrouping. The fountain of youth had eluded him, yes. Florida had been a maze of mangrove swamps, hostile natives, and deceptive shorelines. But in the mind of a conquistador, a land that resists is a land that hides something of value. Failure was merely the price of reconnaissance. He hadn't found the spring, but he had found something else. A vast, uncharted territory he had claimed for Spain. He had given it a name. And in the economy of empire, a name on a map was the first step toward ownership. The whispers of Bimini and its magical waters hadn't died, but they were now competing with a much louder, more tangible ambition. Why search for a spring to extend one life when you could conquer a kingdom and build a legacy that would last for centuries? The new legend he was chasing wasn't one of magic, but of power. It was the legend of becoming an adelantado, a royal governor, a lord of a new land, with the authority of the crown behind him. To achieve this, he had to leave the New World behind and return to the Old. He sailed for Spain in 1514, a place he hadn't seen in over 2 decades. He was no longer the young, anonymous nobleman who had sailed with Columbus. He was Juan Ponce de León, discoverer of Florida, former governor of Puerto Rico, a man of immense wealth and experience. But the Spanish court was a battlefield far more treacherous than any jungle. It was a viper's nest of intrigue, where fortunes were won and lost not with the sword, but with a well-placed word, a strategic bow, a carefully drafted petition. He arrived to find a court obsessed with the promise of the Americas. Every returning captain brought tales that grew taller with each telling, of mountains made of gold, of cities paved with silver, of empires just waiting to be toppled. In this feverish atmosphere, Ponce de León had to sell his vision of Florida. It was a difficult pitch. He had no gold to present to King Ferdinand, no captured kings to display, no intricate jewelry to dazzle the courtiers. All he had was a map of a coastline and a story. He spoke of a land of immense potential, fertile and green. He painted it as a strategic bulwark, a northern anchor for Spain's growing Caribbean empire, a vital checkpoint to control the shipping lanes that would one day, he promised, be overflowing with treasure. And perhaps in a hushed tone, in a private audience with the aging king, he may have mentioned the other rumors, the stories of restorative waters. For a monarch like Ferdinand, whose health was a matter of state security, such a tale, however fanciful, was a seed of possibility worth planting. His persistence, his reputation, and his considerable fortune paid off. In September of 1514, King Ferdinand granted him the patent he craved. It was a document of breathtaking ambition. It gave Ponce de León the exclusive right to explore and, more importantly, to settle the island of Florida. He was named its governor and captain general for life. He and his heirs would be entitled to a handsome share of all the lands, the rents, and any gold or silver discovered. He had won. He was now, by royal decree, the lord of a continent. But the crown's generosity was a gilded cage. The patent came with a list of staggering conditions. Ponce de León had to finance the entire colonization effort himself. He had to outfit at least 3 ships, recruit hundreds of settlers, and transport them across the ocean, all at his own expense. He was required to bring priests to convert the natives, farmers to till the soil, and livestock to populate the pastures. The crown, as was its genius, risked nothing. It simply licensed a private entrepreneur to gamble his entire fortune on a venture that, if successful, would enrich the monarchy beyond measure. With the royal patent secured, his return to Florida seemed imminent. But the king had one more task for his trusted captain. The winds of fortune that had carried him so high were about to blow him sideways. Reports were flooding the court of raids by the Carib people in the Lesser Antilles. They were described as fierce cannibals, terrorizing Spanish settlements and disrupting the brutal but profitable slave trade. Before Ponce de León could build his own colony, he was ordered to pacify the crown's existing ones. He was given command of a fleet and charged with subjugating the Caribs once and for all. What was meant to be a swift police action turned into a bloody, frustrating, and protracted war. The Caribs were masters of their island domain. They fought a guerrilla campaign, melting into the jungle after lightning-fast canoe raids. Ponce de León, the veteran of European and New World warfare, found himself bogged down in a conflict he couldn't win. His fleet was battered by storms, his men were ravaged by disease, and his resources dwindled with every failed skirmish. The mission was a quagmire, a costly and demoralizing distraction that burned through his time, his money, and his men. Years slipped by. The year is now 1521. 7 years have passed since he received his patent to colonize Florida. 7 years of frustration, of fighting in forgotten island chains while other, younger men were seizing their own destinies. And in those 7 years, the world had been turned upside down by a single event. In 1519, a minor nobleman named Hernán Cortés had landed in Mexico. He hadn't found a swamp or a hostile coastline. He had found Tenochtitlan. He had found the Aztec Empire. The news that filtered back to the Caribbean was scarcely believable. It wasn't a rumor of a fountain. It was the reality of an empire whose wealth dwarfed anything the Spanish had ever imagined. Cortés was sending back shiploads of gold, intricate feathered art, and reports of a civilization so advanced it defied comprehension. Suddenly, the entire calculus of the New World had changed. The legend of Aztec gold had not just overshadowed the myth of the Fountain of Youth, it had practically extinguished it. For Ponce de León, this news was both an inspiration and a death knell. He was now over 60 years old. His great prize, Florida, which he had lobbied for and fought for, now seemed like a forgotten backwater compared to the riches of Mexico. The court of the new king, Charles V, was buzzing with the name Cortés. Ponce de León's name, his discovery, was fading into history. He knew he was running out of time. If he didn't act now, his claim on Florida would be revoked, given to some younger, more ambitious conquistador eager to find a second Mexico. The Carib War had drained him, but the news from the West reignited his ambition with the fury of a dying star. This was his last chance, not just for glory but for relevance. He returned to Puerto Rico and began liquidating his entire estate. He poured every last peso of his immense fortune into one final monumental gamble. He purchased 2 ships. He recruited 200 men, a mix of seasoned soldiers, hopeful farmers, and zealous priests. He gathered 50 horses, a formidable weapon of war against a people who had never seen them. He loaded the hulls with tools, seeds, cattle, pigs, and sheep. This was no longer a mission of discovery. This was an armada of colonization. This was an invasion. He was not returning to Florida to delicately search for a mythical spring. He was returning to subjugate a continent, to build a city, to establish the first permanent European settlement in North America, and to claim the empire he had been promised. As his ships prepared to weigh anchor, the old man stood on the deck, the Florida patent in his possession, the ghosts of his past and the pressure of the present weighing on his shoulders. He was sailing back to the land that had rejected him once before, a land whose secrets were far darker and more violent than a hidden fountain. He was sailing to claim his destiny, unaware that he was actually sailing toward his end. The year is 1521. 8 long years had passed since Ponce de León had first laid eyes on the verdant coastline of La Florida. 8 years of courtly intrigue, of managing his estates, of growing older. The fire of ambition, however, had not been quenched by time. It had been banked, smoldering, waiting for the right wind to be fanned back into a roaring flame. That wind came in the form of a royal patent, a grant from the Spanish crown. This was no mere license to explore. This was a charge to colonize. He was now Don Juan Ponce de León, Adelantado of Bimini in Florida, a governor tasked with subjugating a land and its people. The dream of a mystical fountain had been subsumed by the cold, hard machinery of empire. His fleet was a different beast this time. Not the nimble caravels of a hopeful explorer, but 2 sturdier ships packed to the gunwales with the tools of conquest. 200 men, a mix of seasoned soldiers, hopeful farmers, and zealous priests. 50 horses, their hooves stamping nervously in the cramped holds, a terrifying new weapon for a new world. They carried livestock, farming implements, and seeds. They carried crossbows, arquebus, and steel swords. They carried the cross and the flag of Castile. They were not here to ask for a drink from a magical spring. They were here to build a new Spain, to carve a permanent Christian settlement out of the wilderness. Ponce de León, now in his late 40s, perhaps felt the weight of his age more than ever. This was his last great gamble, his final chance to etch his name alongside the giants like Columbus and Cortés, whose recent spectacular conquest of the Aztec Empire echoed across the Atlantic. As the Florida coastline once again rose from the horizon, it must have looked just as it had 8 years prior, an unbroken emerald expanse, shimmering under the subtropical sun. But the reception was vastly different. There was no tentative curiosity this time, no cautious exchange of trinkets on a sun-drenched beach. The people of this land, the Calusa, had learned of the Spanish. Perhaps they had encountered other explorers. Perhaps stories of the cruelty and disease that followed these strange, pale men had drifted down from other islands. Whatever the reason, they were prepared. They were waiting. The Spanish chose a landing spot, likely near modern-day Charlotte Harbor, a strategic location with access to the sea. As the longboats scraped against the sand and the armored soldiers waded ashore, the air, thick with the scent of salt and mangrove, suddenly erupted. It was a storm of sound and fury. A high-pitched war cry ripped through the tranquility, and from the dense tree line, a wave of warriors emerged. These were the Calusa, a powerful and sophisticated kingdom that had dominated southern Florida for centuries. They were not scattered, frightened tribesmen. They were a disciplined fighting force, their bodies painted for war, their movements swift and coordinated. The land of flowers greeted them not with life-giving water, but with a shower of arrows. The projectiles, tipped with razor-sharp flint, shark teeth, or the spines of stingrays, whistled through the air with terrifying accuracy. They thudded into wooden shields, glanced off steel helmets, and with sickening precision, found the gaps in the Spaniards' armor. The conquistadors, for all their technological superiority, were caught off guard. They were clumsy in the soft sand, their heavy armor a sweltering prison in the oppressive humidity. They fired their arquebus, the deafening roar and belch of smoke momentarily scattering the Calusa warriors, but the reload time was agonizingly slow. In the time it took one Spanish soldier to reload his primitive firearm, a Calusa archer could loose a dozen arrows. Ponce de León, the veteran commander, bellowed orders, trying to form a defensive line, to push the beachhead and secure their position. But the Calusa were masters of this terrain. They used the landscape as a weapon, melting back into the dense forests and swamps only to reappear and strike from a different direction. It was a brutal, bloody welcome. The Spanish dream of a peaceful settlement, of tilling fertile soil and converting willing souls, died right there on the beach, choked by blood and sand. Over the next few months, the colonists tried desperately to establish their settlement. They cleared land, built crude wooden structures, and planted their European crops, which withered in the unfamiliar soil and unforgiving heat. But Florida itself seemed to be fighting against them. The heat was a physical entity, a crushing weight that drained their strength and spirit. The air was thick with insects they had never known, mosquitoes that rose in black clouds at dusk, carrying fevers that left men delirious and weak. The swamps, teeming with alligators and venomous snakes, were a constant lurking threat. This was not the Garden of Eden they had imagined. It was a beautiful but utterly hostile world that wanted them gone. And all the while the Calusa watched. They harassed the settlement relentlessly. A sentry would disappear from his post in the dead of night. A foraging party would be ambushed, leaving only a few survivors to stagger back to camp with horrific stories. The hunter of eternal life was now the hunted. The great conquistador who had pacified Puerto Rico found himself besieged, unable to control the land just beyond his crude palisade. The morale of his men plummeted. They were not finding gold or glory. They were finding disease, starvation, and a violent death at the hands of an enemy they could not pin down. The dream of the fountain was now a bitter joke, a ghost that mocked Ponce de León in his sweltering tent. He had come seeking a cure for old age, but this land was aging him faster than time ever could. The strain of command, the constant fear, the failure of his great enterprise, it was all etched onto his face. He knew he had to break the stalemate. He needed a decisive victory to crush the Calusa's will to fight and save his colony from collapse. He organized a large armed party to push inland, to confront the Calusa on their own terms. It was a fatal miscalculation. As they marched into the dense foliage, they walked straight into a perfectly laid ambush. The attack was sudden, overwhelming, and utterly devastating. The Calusa descended upon them from all sides, their war cries echoing through the trees. It was a chaotic melee of flashing steel, splintering wood, and desperate screams. In the heart of the fighting, Ponce de León, clad in his steel breastplate, fought like the soldier he had always been. But armor cannot cover every inch of a man. As he rallied his troops, a searing pain shot through his thigh. He looked down and saw the feathered shaft of an arrow protruding from his leg, just above the knee where the armor plates met. It wasn't a deep wound, not one that should have been fatal to a man of his strength, but the Calusa often tipped their arrows with poison, using the sap of the manchineel tree, a substance so toxic it was known to the Spanish as the Árbol de la Muerte, the tree of death. The battle was lost. The Spanish broke ranks and fled back toward the relative safety of their camp, carrying their wounded leader. The pain from Ponce de León's wound was immediate and excruciating, but soon a creeping fever began to take hold. The poison was in his blood. The man who had crossed an ocean in search of a mythical cure for death now lay dying from a very real poison, delivered by the people whose land he had tried to steal. The irony was absolute, a final cruel joke played by fate. His expedition was a catastrophic failure. The settlement was abandoned. The survivors, demoralized and defeated, loaded their dying governor onto one of the ships. They set sail not for Spain, but for the closest Spanish outpost where he might find a doctor: Havana, Cuba. As the shores of La Florida receded for the last time, Ponce de León, delirious with fever, drifted in and out of consciousness. The land of flowers, the land he had named in a moment of hopeful discovery, had rejected him utterly. The arrow that struck him was not just a piece of flint and wood. It was the final fatal answer to his quest. He didn't find a fountain that could grant eternal life, but he had found in its place a swift and agonizing end. And so the great explorer, the first governor of Puerto Rico, the man who gave Florida its name, died not in a palace surrounded by gold, but in the sweltering heat of a Cuban settlement, his body racked with poison and his dreams reduced to ash. His final voyage was a catastrophe. His men were routed, his plans were shattered, and his life was extinguished by the very people whose land he sought to claim. In the end, one Ponce de León's quest, whatever its true nature, led only to a painful, ignominious death far from the glory he so desperately craved. But here's where the story takes a truly bizarre turn, because death is often not an ending, but a new beginning for a person's story. And in the case of Ponce de León, his death was the fertile ground from which the greatest myth about him would grow. The man was gone, but the legend was just getting started. For decades after his death, his name was associated with conquest, with governance, with brutal campaigns and the acquisition of wealth. The Fountain of Youth was a minor footnote, a piece of local folklore he might have heard about, but certainly not the driving obsession of his life. So how did it happen? How did a hardened, middle-aged conquistador, primarily interested in gold, land and titles, become the poster child for a fantastical quest for eternal life? The answer lies not in Ponce de León's own journals, but in the writings of his enemies. History, as they say, is written by the victors. But sometimes, it's also written by the rivals who outlive you. Enter Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo y Valdés. Oviedo was a courtier, a naturalist and a historian, the official chronicler of the Indies for the Spanish crown. He was also a contemporary and a fierce critic of Ponce de León. The two men did not like each other. Oviedo saw Ponce de León as a vain, overly ambitious, and ultimately foolish man. And in his monumental work, Historia General y Natural de las Indias, published in part starting in 1535, a full 14 years after Ponce de León's death, Oviedo decided to shape his rival's legacy. He took the vague rumors and local legends about a restorative spring, rumors that were a dime a dozen in the Caribbean, and he surgically attached them to Ponce de León's 1513 expedition to Florida. But he didn't present it as a noble quest. Oh no, Oviedo framed it as the ultimate act of vanity and folly. He wrote that Ponce de León, feeling himself growing old, was so gullible, so desperate to regain his virility and take more pleasure in his own body, that he wasted a fortune and the lives of his men chasing a children's fairy tale. In Oviedo's telling, this wasn't an epic search for immortality. It was a pathetic midlife crisis. He painted a picture of a ridiculous old man, addled by age, sailing off on a fool's errand while more serious men were engaged in the proper business of conquest and empire. It was a calculated, posthumous character assassination, a smear campaign from beyond the grave. Oviedo's goal was likely to diminish Ponce de León's real accomplishments, like naming and charting parts of Florida, by making his primary motivation seem laughable. And for a time among the Spanish elite it worked. Ponce de León became a cautionary tale, a punchline. But a funny thing happens with a good story. It escapes the control of its author. What Oviedo intended as an insult, a way to make his rival look foolish, was simply too good a tale to dismiss. The idea of a European knight, clad in armor, searching the swamps of a strange new world for a magical fountain that could reverse time? That's not a joke. That's the stuff of epic poetry. It had romance, tragedy, and a deep, universal human desire at its core. The story was given another, even more significant boost a few decades later by a man named Hernando de Escalante Fontaneda. Fontaneda had a life story that was arguably more incredible than Ponce de León's. As a boy, he was shipwrecked off the coast of Florida and lived for 17 years as a captive among the Calusa tribe, the very same people who would later kill Ponce de León. After being rescued, he wrote a memoir in 1575 detailing his experiences. In his memoir, Fontaneda mentions that the tribes of Florida and Cuba spoke of a mythical, restorative river he called the River Jordan, and that Juan Ponce de León had gone to Florida to find it. Now this was different. This wasn't a bitter rival mocking from a distance. This was a man who had lived with the native people, who spoke their language, and who was now confirming that, yes, this legend was real to them, and yes, Ponce de León had come looking for it. Fontanetta's account seemed to lend credibility to Oviedo's story, transforming it from a piece of political slander into a historical possibility. He stripped away Oviedo's mocking tone and presented the quest as a matter of fact. And with that, the myth was solidified. The two narratives, Oviedo's insult and Fontanetta's eyewitness confirmation, merged. Subsequent historians, lacking Ponce de León's own records on the matter, simply repeated the story. They took the legend and ran with it. The tale was retold and embellished over and over, each telling adding a new layer of detail and drama. The real man, the ruthless, ambitious, and complex governor, was sanded down, his rough edges smoothed away, until all that was left was a two-dimensional caricature. The tragic, obsessed seeker of eternal youth. The irony is staggering. A man who spent his life seeking power, wealth, and a lasting name for himself in the annals of Spanish conquest achieved his most enduring fame for a quest he likely never undertook, a motivation he likely never had, all thanks to the pen of a man who despised him. Ponce de León didn't find the fountain of youth, but his enemies inadvertently gave him something close: historical immortality, albeit for all the wrong reasons. This newly minted legend was too potent to stay confined to Spanish chronicles. As the centuries passed and the New World became the stage for new empires, the story of Ponce de León and his fountain seeped into the consciousness of the English-speaking world. American writers of the 19th century like Washington Irving were captivated by it. They romanticized the story, transforming the gritty conquistador into a tragic hero, a symbol of the human struggle against mortality. The painter Thomas Moran immortalized the quest on a grand, dramatic canvas. The myth had found a new home in a new nation, a nation that was itself obsessed with new beginnings, endless frontiers, and the idea of reinventing oneself. The Fountain of Youth became a uniquely American myth, grafted onto the history of Florida. It explained the state's appeal as a place of rejuvenation and retirement. It became a story told to schoolchildren, a landmark on tourist maps, a brand name. The real history, the violence, the disease, the brutal realities of colonization, was conveniently washed away by the clear, magical waters of the mythical spring. The story was just better, cleaner, more inspiring. And so the lie became the truth. A piece of political gossip, meant to tarnish a man's name, instead made him a legend. It illustrates a profound truth about history. The most powerful force isn't always the sword or the crown, but the story. A compelling narrative can outlive armies, outlast empires, and completely reshape the memory of a man, turning a conqueror into a dreamer, and a lust for gold into a search for eternal life. But the story doesn't end there, because while historians were busy cementing the myth of the past, others were beginning to wonder, what if the fountain wasn't just a myth? The legend of a magical spring in Florida refused to die. It took root in a specific place, a city that would proudly claim to be the home of the fabled spring, turning a 500-year-old legend into a thriving business. The search for the Fountain of Youth was about to move from the pages of history books and into the realm of roadside attractions, where anyone, for the price of a ticket, could take a sip from the waters that promised to hold back time. And so the legend of the Fountain of Youth, once the obsession of kings and the quest of conquistadors, found its most enduring home not in a hidden jungle, but on a quiet plot of land in St. Augustine, Florida. Here, the myth was repackaged, polished, and sold to a new generation of seekers, not with promises of glory and conquest, but with the simple allure of a vacation souvenir. The Fountain of Youth Archaeological Park, as it came to be known, is a masterclass in American ingenuity, a place where history, legend, and commerce blend so seamlessly you can no longer tell them apart. The story of this particular fountain doesn't begin with Ponce de León, but with a woman of extraordinary vision and questionable historical accuracy, Luella de McConnell, also known as Diamond Lil. In the late 1890s, she bought the property and, armed with a flair for the dramatic, began weaving a tale that would prove more potent than any historical document. She claimed to have found a buried coquina cross, its arms pointing to the 13 colonies, supposedly laid by Ponce de León himself. She asserted that the spring on her land was the very one the explorer had sought. There was, of course, absolutely no evidence for any of this. The historical record shows Ponce de León likely never even set foot in St. Augustine. But in the burgeoning tourism industry of Florida, facts were often less important than a good story. And Luella had a spectacular one. She built a small spring house, began charging admission, and sold cups of the sulfurous water to curious tourists. It was a brilliant move. The myth, once an intangible dream, was now a physical destination. You could stand on the spot. You could see the evidence. Most importantly, you could drink the water. For a small fee, you could participate in the legend yourself. The park grew, adding exhibits about the local Timucua tribe, a planetarium, and even a flock of strutting peacocks, symbols of immortality in ancient cultures. It became a roadside institution, a place where families could spend an afternoon absorbing a sanitized, romanticized version of the age of exploration. And what of the water itself? Visitors who cup their hands and take a sip are often surprised. It has a distinct, mineral-heavy, sulfurous taste. It's not the sweet, crystalline nectar of myth, but rather the pungent tang of groundwater filtered through layers of shell and limestone. Chemical analysis has confirmed what common sense suggests. It's just water. It holds no magical properties, no secret enzymes, no age-defying isotopes. Yet millions have drunk it. They pose for photos, they fill souvenir bottles, they laugh about the taste. But underneath the kitsch and the commercialism, a flicker of that ancient hope remains. The act of drinking is a ritual, a small gesture of defiance against the inevitable. It's a moment of what if, a playful nod to the universal human desire to turn back the clock, even just for a moment. The park in St. Augustine isn't really selling water. It's selling a feeling. It's selling a connection to a 500-year-old story. But while tourists were sipping from a manufactured legend in Florida, a new kind of explorer was embarking on a far more serious quest. These new seekers weren't guided by crumbling maps or indigenous rumors. Their tools were not the sword and the compass, but the microscope and the gene sequencer. Their uncharted territory was not a new continent, but the vast, intricate landscape of the human cell. The search for the fountain of youth was leaving the realm of geography and entering the world of biology. The question was no longer where is it, but what is it? The modern quest for longevity is, in essence, the scientific continuation of Ponce de Leon's voyage. The goal is the same: to radically extend human life, to halt or even reverse the process of aging. But the approach is fundamentally different. Scientists now understand that aging isn't a mystical curse or a singular process. It's a complex cascade of biological breakdowns, a series of tiny failures that accumulate over time. And if it's a biological process, they reason it can be understood. And if it can be understood, it can be manipulated. One of the first major discoveries in this new world were telomeres. Think of them as the plastic tips on the ends of your shoelaces. Your shoelaces are your chromosomes, the tightly coiled strands of your DNA. Every time a cell divides, those telomeres get a little bit shorter. When they become too short, the cell can no longer divide safely and either dies or enters a zombie-like state. This shortening of telomeres acts as a kind of biological clock, counting down the lifespan of our cells. The hunt was on for a way to stop this clock, to find an enzyme, a drug, a therapy that could rebuild these protective caps, effectively giving our cells more time. Then came the discovery of senescent cells, the so-called zombie cells. These are cells that have reached the end of their telomere rope or have suffered other damage. They stop dividing, but they refuse to die. Instead, they linger, spewing out a cocktail of inflammatory proteins that damage the healthy cells around them. They are the troublemakers of the aging body, contributing to everything from arthritis and heart disease to dementia. This discovery led to a thrilling new field of medicine focused on creating senolytics, drugs designed to selectively hunt down and destroy these zombie cells, clearing out the accumulated junk of aging and allowing tissues to rejuvenate. The new conquistadors of biology began to map the very pathways that control aging. They found that drastically reducing calorie intake seemed to extend the lifespan of countless organisms, from yeast to mice. This wasn't just about weight. It was about activating ancient survival circuits within our cells. They identified key genetic pathways with names like mTOR and AMPK that act as master regulators of cell growth and repair. The new fountain, it seemed, might not be a liquid you drink but a pill you take, a drug like rapamycin which can mimic the effects of caloric restriction without the constant hunger, tricking the body into activating its own longevity programs. And beyond all this lies the ultimate frontier, the genetic code itself. With the advent of technologies like CRISPR, Scientists now have the power to edit the source code of life. They can, in theory, go into our DNA and rewrite the instructions that lead to aging and disease. They are identifying genes that control lifespan, genes that protect against cellular damage, and genes that promote regeneration. The dream is no longer just to slow aging, but to edit it out of our biology entirely. This new quest, this scientific odyssey, is not being funded by 16th-century Spanish monarchs. It's being bankrolled by the new royalty of our age, the tech billionaires of Silicon Valley. Men like Jeff Bezos, Larry Page, and Peter Thiel are pouring hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars into a constellation of ambitious biotech startups. Companies with futuristic names like Calico Labs, Altos Labs, and Unity Biotechnology have become the modern-day expeditions, staffed with Nobel laureates and the brightest minds in biology. For these patrons, the search is both a business opportunity and a deeply personal crusade. They have conquered the digital world, reshaped global commerce, and accumulated wealth beyond the wildest dreams of any king. Now they face the one enemy that money has never been able to defeat: time itself. They are not content to simply live well. They want to live longer, perhaps indefinitely. They are funding the construction of a new kind of fountain, one built not of stone and water, but of data, gene therapies, and pharmaceuticals. They don't just want to find it for humanity. They want to be the first to drink from it. The journey that began in the mythical gardens of Eden and wound through the swamps of Florida has now led us to the sterile, brightly lit laboratories of the 21st century. The prize is the same, but the stakes have never been higher. For if they succeed, if this new generation of explorers finally unlocks the secrets to eternal youth, it will force humanity to confront its most profound questions. What does it mean to be human if death is no longer a certainty? And in a world where life can be extended, who will get to decide how long is long enough? These aren't questions for some distant science fiction future. They are the questions knocking on our door right now, carried on the winds of scientific revolution. The quest for the fountain of youth never ended. It simply changed its address. It moved from the humid swamps of Florida to the sterile, climate-controlled laboratories of Silicon Valley and the research capitals of the world. The modern Ponce de Leons aren't grizzled explorers with compasses and swords. They're biotech billionaires with gene sequencers and algorithms. They're not searching for a mythical spring. They're searching for the source code of life itself, convinced that aging isn't a certainty, but a bug in the system that can be patched. And they are making terrifying, exhilarating progress. Scientists can now reprogram cells, turning old cells young again in a petri dish. They're studying the long-lived marvels of the natural world. The Greenland shark that can live for 500 years, the immortal jellyfish that can revert to its juvenile state when threatened. They are targeting the very hallmarks of aging. The fraying ends of our chromosomes called telomeres, the buildup of senescent zombie cells that poison our bodies from within, the slow decay of our mitochondrial power plants. Drugs like rapamycin and metformin, once used for other purposes, are now being studied for their incredible life-extending properties in animals, showing tantalizing promise for humans. The new elixirs aren't bubbling from the earth. They're being synthesized in labs, designed to trick our own biology into repairing itself, into fighting off the relentless march of time. This is the new frontier, a world where your lifespan isn't dictated by fate, but by technology. And this leads to the most chilling question of all, the one that truly keeps ethicists up at night. If the cure for death comes with a price tag, what kind of world does that create? A world divided not by wealth or power in the traditional sense, but by mortality itself. A permanent biological caste system, the deathless and the dying. An upper class of the eternally young, accumulating wealth, power, and knowledge over centuries, while the vast majority of humanity lives and dies on the old schedule, looking up at their immortal overlords as if they were gods on a new Mount Olympus. The social contract would be shattered. What would a 100-year-old mortal have in common with a 1,000-year-old immortal? It would be the greatest inequality in human history, an unbridgeable chasm between two different species, both of which began as human. But even if we could solve that, even if radical life extension became as common and accessible as clean water, we must face an even deeper problem. What would we do with all that time? We define our lives by their chapters: childhood, adolescence, adulthood, old age. We learn, we love, we build, we teach, and then we fade. This cycle, this rhythm, has defined every human society that has ever existed. Fuels ambition. It creates urgency. The knowledge that our time is limited is the fire that drives us to create art, to build monuments, to have children, to say I love you before it's too late. Think about it. Every great story needs an ending to be meaningful. Every song needs a final note to give the silence that follows it purpose. Would the Mona Lisa be as breathtaking if you knew you had 1,000,000 years to look at it? Would a first kiss feel as electric if you knew there could be 1,000,000,000 more stretched across an endless expanse of time? Or would life become a flat, featureless plane of endless tomorrows? Would we become a species of perpetual procrastinators, always putting off our dreams until the next century, or the one after that? Without the turnover of generations, society could stagnate. New ideas, new perspectives, and new movements are often championed by the young, who see the world with fresh eyes, unburdened by the dogmas of the past. If the same generations held power for centuries, could we ever truly change? We might solve the problem of biological death only to succumb to a societal death, a permanent sclerosis of culture, innovation, and progress, ruled by the ancient and unchanging. And what if our planet, a world of billions of people who never leave, would place an unimaginable strain on our resources? Overpopulation would transform from a pressing concern into an existential crisis of the highest order. Would we have to institute a one-in, one-out policy? Would you have to get a license to have a child, granted only when someone else agrees to finally check out? The ethical nightmares are endless. The fountain of youth has always been a mirror. In its mythical waters, we don't see a reflection of a younger self. We see a reflection of our deepest anxieties and our most profound hopes. It's a story about our relationship with time itself. We fear death, yes, but perhaps deep down we also fear a life without it. We fear meaninglessness. We fear boredom. We fear becoming ghosts in our own endless existence. The legend has endured for centuries not because we literally believe in a magical spring, but because it represents one of the most fundamental human desires: the desire for more. More time, more life, more chances. The quest, from Ponce de León to the modern biohacker, is fueled by the same universal engine, the profound, aching love of being alive. It's a love so fierce that it refuses to accept the final curtain. And in that refusal, we find the ultimate paradox. The frantic search for eternal life forces us to confront, with brutal honesty, what makes our finite lives worth living in the first place. It's the connections we make, the knowledge we gain, the beauty we create, the love we give and receive. These are the things that give a life, whether it lasts 80 years or 800, its weight and its value. Maybe the secret to living forever isn't about not dying. It's about living a life so full, so rich with purpose and love, that it creates a legacy that echoes in the lives of others, in the progress of our species, in the stories told long after we are gone. That is the kind of immortality we can all strive for right now. The waters of the fountain promise to quench our thirst for more time, but the real elixir might be found in quenching our thirst for a life of meaning within the time we have. The myth of the fountain of youth is not a treasure map to be followed. It is a question to be answered. And the question is not, where can I find eternal life? The question is, what will you do with the precious, fleeting life you already have? In the end, the greatest legend isn't the spring itself, but the human heart that dares to search for it, knowing perhaps that the journey, the relentless, hopeful, beautiful struggle for more life, is the only destination that truly matters.